Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a deep dive into something that might just change how you think about, well, everything.
It really might.
The 80-20 principle. Have you heard of it?
Oh, I have. It's amazing how often it pops up.
It does. The idea is that 80% of your results actually come from just 20% of your efforts.
And that can apply to, anything, productivity or your finances or even relationships.
Exactly. And we're going to explore all those areas today using Richard Koch's book, Living the 80-20 Way. This book is packed with so many fascinating examples and strategies.
It really is. It's a great way to kind of rethink how we approach just about everything we do.
Exactly. So I'm excited to dive in, but before we do, let's just ground ourselves in the basics. Can you just quickly explain the core concept of the 80-20 principle for anyone who might be new to this idea?
Sure. Essentially, the 80-20 principle suggests that in many areas of life, 80% of our outcomes result from just 20% of our inputs. So instead of spreading our energy evenly across all our tasks or activities, we can achieve significantly better results by focusing on that critical 20% that really moves the needle.
It's like finding that sweet spot, right? Where our efforts have the most leverage.
Precisely. It's about working smarter, not harder.
I love that. But I have to admit, it sounds a bit too good to be true. Can you give us a concrete example of how this principle actually plays out in the real world?
Well, think about the evolution of computers. Decades ago, they were these massive machines that took up entire rooms and had very limited power. Now, we have tiny smartphones that fit in our pockets and are exponentially more powerful.
Right. And it's not just about technology. Agriculture is another great example. A few centuries ago, almost the entire workforce was engaged in farming. Today, it's a tiny fraction, yet we produce more food than ever before.
Exactly. It highlights that progress isn't always about sheer effort or brute force. It's about finding those leverage points, that crucial 20% that drives the majority of the results.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Reminds me of an example Koch uses in his book about a freelancer who intentionally limits themselves to just one day a week to complete all their work. Seems counterintuitive, right?
It does, but the idea is that this time constraint forces them to prioritize and focus intensely on the most important tasks, leading to better results.
It's like that saying, work expands to fill the time allotted. So by intentionally limiting the time, we're essentially forcing ourselves to be more efficient and focused.
Exactly. It's a great example of how the 80-20 principle can challenge our traditional notions of productivity and time management.
I love that. So this principle is about identifying that critical 20% that really drives our outcomes. But how do we actually do that? How do we know what to focus on?
Well, Koch outlines a clear three-step process in the book. And the first step is to define your destination.
Okay, define your destination. So before we even think about the 20%, we need to have a clear vision of where we're headed. What are our ultimate goals?
Exactly. What are those things that truly matter to us, both personally and professionally?
Right. It's about identifying those big rocks in our lives, the things that bring us the most fulfillment and align with our values.
Right. And the book is a great example of this with Skev, a restaurant owner who decides to apply the 80-20 principle to his life. He identifies his top priorities as building his business, nurturing his love for music, and really focusing on his close relationships.
So he's not limiting himself to just professional goals.
Yeah.
He's thinking about his whole life.
Yeah, because the 80-20 principle can apply to any area of life, not just work or productivity.
That makes sense. So step one is all about identifying what really matters to us. But once we've done that, how do we actually start applying the 80-20 principle to achieve those goals?
Well, that brings us to step two, chart your route.
Chart your route. So this is where we start figuring out the how. How do we get from where we are to where we want to be?
Exactly. And this step encourages us to think outside the box. Let's say you want to be a top salesperson. The traditional route might be to, take sales courses or something. But maybe there's a faster or more efficient path that aligns with the 80-20 principle.
Like maybe finding a mentor who's already achieved that level of success. Or focusing on building genuine relationships with potential clients instead of just cold calling.
Precisely. It's about finding those strategies that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak.
So it's not just about blindly following the traditional path, but being a bit more strategic and intentional in how we approach our goals. We're looking for that 80-20 route.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that this doesn't mean we have to neglect everything outside of that 20%.
Right. It's not about becoming hyper-focused to the point where we miss out on other valuable experiences. It's about recognizing where our efforts are going to have the most impact.
Exactly. It's a guiding principle, not a rigid rule.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've defined our destination, we've charted our route. What's the next step?
Well, the next step is where the rubber meets the road. It's time to take action.
Take action. I love it. But taking action in a way that aligns with the 80-20 principle, right? It's not just about blindly rushing forward, but being strategic and intentional with our efforts.
Precisely. And that can often mean letting go of the need to do it all or to do everything perfectly.
Right. It's about accepting that we can't be everything to everyone and focusing our energy where it truly counts.
Yeah.
But speaking of energy, I'm curious about this concept of happiness islands that Koch talks about in the book. It sounds intriguing.
It is. You know how we often feel like we're constantly battling against time?
Oh, absolutely. There's never enough time in the day.
Right. But what if, instead of always trying to squeeze more into our day, we focused on identifying those periods when we feel most happy and productive?
Our peak times. Those moments when our energy and focus are naturally high.
Exactly. Those are our happiness islands. And the 80-20 principle suggests that we can achieve much more by leveraging those times than by constantly pushing ourselves when we're feeling drained or uninspired.
So it's about recognizing and working with our natural rhythms instead of always trying to fight against them.
Precisely. And the book tells this amazing story about Richard Adams.
Wait, are you talking about the Richard Adams, the author of Watership Down?
The one and only?
Wow. I had no idea he was connected to the 80-20 principle. What's the story?
Well, before he was a famous author, he was a bored bureaucrat.
Okay, so not exactly living the dream.
Not quite. But he found his happiness islands in telling stories to his daughters. And those moments of joy and connection ultimately led him to write Watership Down.
No way. So one of the most beloved children's books of all time was born out of those happiness islands. That's incredible.
It is, and it highlights a really important point about the 80-20 principle. It's not always about striving or pushing ourselves to the limit. Sometimes our most fulfilling work comes from simply nurturing those activities that bring us joy and allow us to tap into our natural strengths and passions.
So instead of always focusing on what we should be doing, maybe we should also pay attention to those times when we're naturally in our flow state, where work feels effortless and we're most productive.
Exactly. And it's not just about work. This applies to any area of life. Think about your hobbies, your relationships, anything that brings you joy. Those are your happiness islands.
I love that. It's such a simple but powerful shift in perspective. But realistically, not everything we do in life can be done during our peak hours, right?
Right.
There are always going to be those tasks that we just have to grit our teeth and get through.
Yeah.
So how do we approach those less than thrilling tasks while still staying true to the 80-20 principle?
Well, that's a great question, and that's something we're going to dive into right after the break. Well, sometimes you just have to, delegate those tasks or automate them if you can.
Delegate or automate. That makes sense. So it's about freeing up our time and energy to focus on those things that are more aligned with our 20%.
Exactly. And sometimes it's also about recognizing that some things might not actually need to be done at all.
Ah, the power of letting go. That's a good one. But all this talk about focusing our energy and being more efficient with our time, it makes me think about, well, finances. Is there a way to apply the 80-20 principle to manage our money better?
Absolutely. The 80-20 principle can be a game changer when it comes to personal finances. And, there's this misconception out there that you need a lot of money to make more money.
Right, like you have to be some kind of Wall Street tycoon or something.
Exactly. But the 80-20 principle suggests otherwise. Take long-term investing, for instance. You don't need a huge sum of money to get started.
I'm listening. Tell me more about that.
Well, even small amounts of money can yield surprisingly large returns over time, thanks to the power of compounding.
Okay, compounding. Can you explain that in simple terms for those of us who aren't exactly financial wizards?
Sure. Compounding is essentially like a snowball effect. It's where you earn returns not just on your initial investment, but also on the accumulated interest.
So your money is basically making more money for you.
Precisely. And over time, this can lead to significant growth.
Like how significant are we talking? Do you have any real-life examples of this compounding magic at work?
Oh, absolutely. The book tells the story of Anne Schreiber. She invested just $5,000 in the stock market back in 1945.
$5,000. That doesn't seem like a lot, especially back then.
Right. But guess how much that investment was worth by 1995?
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me the grand reveal.
A whopping $22 million.
$22 million. That's incredible. So you're saying that even a small investment, if given enough time to compound, can grow exponentially.
Exactly. It's a powerful testament to the 80-20 principle in action. It's not always about the size of the input, but about making smart choices and being consistent over time.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But I think a lot of people, myself included, get intimidated by the idea of investing. It can seem so complex, like you need to have this specialized knowledge to even get started.
I totally get that. But it doesn't have to be complicated. There are simple and effective ways to start investing, even if you don't have a lot of experience.
Like what?
Well, one popular strategy is investing in index funds. They're basically baskets of stocks that track a particular market index, like the S&P 500.
Index funds, I've heard of those. But why are they a good option, especially for beginners?
Well, they offer a few key advantages. First, they're diversified, which means your money is spread across multiple companies, reducing your risk.
So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And second, they generally have lower fees compared to actively managed funds, which can eat into your returns.
Got it. So you're suggesting that even small, consistent investments in index funds can lead to significant gains over time thanks to that compounding effect.
Exactly. It's a classic 80-20 approach to investing, focusing on a simple, effective strategy that delivers the most impact.
So it's not just about investing. The 80-20 principle can also help us become better savers.
Absolutely. And, saving doesn't have to be this daunting task. The book shares a story about Steve and Helen. They're a couple who set a goal of buying a $60,000 apartment.
Okay, $60,000. That's a pretty significant goal.
It is. And they weren't earning huge salaries, but they committed to automatically transferring 10% of their income into a savings account each month.
So they basically automated their savings.
Exactly. They made it a habit, a non-negotiable part of their budget. And in just 6 years, they had saved enough to buy their dream apartment.
Wow, that's really inspiring. It shows that consistent action, even if it's in small increments, can lead to big results over time. It's about building those positive habits and sticking with them. But speaking of relationships, I'm curious how the 80-20 principle can help us build stronger, more fulfilling connections with the people in our lives.
That's another great area to apply the 80-20 principle. It's so easy to get caught up in trying to please everyone and spreading ourselves too thin when it comes to relationships.
Right, like we feel obligated to say yes to every invitation or maintain contact with everyone we've ever met.
Exactly. And we can end up investing time and energy in connections that aren't truly serving us or bringing us joy.
So you're saying the 80-20 principle can help us be more intentional about the relationships we choose to nurture.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that our time and energy are precious resources and choosing to invest them in the relationships that matter most.
But wouldn't that make us seem selfish or dismissive of people outside our chosen circle? Like we're playing favorites with our relationships.
It's not about disregarding others or being exclusive. It's about understanding that we have limited time and energy and that we can't be everything to everyone. Just like with any other area of life, the 80-20 principle encourages us to identify those relationships that bring us the most joy and support and to prioritize those connections.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about being more mindful and intentional with our relationships.
Absolutely.
And this is especially important in romantic partnerships, right?
Absolutely. Studies have shown that people in happy and fulfilling relationships tend to report higher levels of overall well-being and satisfaction with life.
That makes sense. A supportive and loving relationship can definitely contribute to our overall happiness. But as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. What if our partner doesn't necessarily embrace the 80-20 way of thinking? Could that create friction in the relationship?
That's a good question. And it's certainly possible that different approaches to life can create challenges in a relationship. However, the beauty of the 80-20 principle is that it's not about imposing our way of thinking on others. It's about understanding our own priorities and then finding ways to align our actions with those priorities, even within the context of a relationship.
So it's about open communication and finding a way to balance our individual needs with the needs of the relationship.
Exactly. And the book highlights Steve, the restaurant owner we talked about earlier. He realized early on that reliability and support were crucial for his partner, Helen.
So he made a conscious effort to prioritize those needs.
Absolutely. Even surprising her with thoughtful gestures that showed he cared. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about those small, consistent actions that reinforced his love and support.
So it's about understanding what matters most to our partner and then finding those small but impactful ways to express our love and support.
Precisely. It's about being intentional and focused in our efforts, even within the dynamic of a relationship.
This whole conversation has really expanded my understanding of how the 80-20 principle can be applied in so many different areas of life. But I'm curious, how does this principle play into the idea of learning and personal growth? Could focusing on just 20% of the information actually help us learn more effectively?
That's a brilliant question. And it's an area where the 80-20 principle can be incredibly powerful. We often get bogged down trying to absorb every single detail when we're learning something new.
Right. Like we feel like we need to memorize everything in the textbook or attend every single lecture.
Exactly. But what if we focused on identifying and understanding the core 20% of information that underpins the topic? That could provide a much stronger foundation for further exploration.
It's like finding the key that unlocks the rest of the door, isn't it? But how do we even begin to identify that crucial 20% of information?
It requires a shift in mindset from passive absorption to active engagement with the material. Instead of just trying to take it all in, we need to be asking ourselves questions like, what are the fundamental principles here? Or what are the key takeaways that I really need to remember?
So it's about being discerning with the information we consume and prioritizing understanding over rote memorization.
Precisely. It's about finding the signal in the noise, and it's also crucial to tailor our learning methods to our individual preferences.
Right, because what works for one person might not work for another. We all have different learning styles.
Exactly. Some people might find reading the most effective way to grasp new concepts, while others might thrive in a more hands-on experiential environment. The key is to identify those happiness islands for learning, those methods that bring us joy and make the information stick.
Happiness islands for learning. I love that. It's about finding those ways of learning that feel effortless and enjoyable.
Exactly. And it's not just about acquiring knowledge. The 80-20 principle can also be a powerful tool for problem solving.
Okay, how so? I'm all ears.
Well, what if, instead of getting overwhelmed by a multitude of potential causes for a problem, we focused on identifying the 20% of factors that are contributing to 80% of the issue?
Ah, so it's about cutting through the noise and focusing on the root causes, the things that are having the biggest impact.
Exactly. Imagine the time and energy we could save by addressing those few key factors that are likely driving the majority of the problem.
It's a much more strategic and efficient approach to problem solving, for sure. And it aligns perfectly with the 80-20 principle. This whole conversation has been incredibly enlightening. It feels like the 80-20 principle is a key that unlocks a more intentional and fulfilling way of living. But it's not about becoming a productivity machine or achieving some idealized version of success, is it?
Absolutely not. The 80-20 principle isn't about striving for perfection or pushing ourselves to the limit. It's about aligning our actions with our values and aspirations.
So it's about designing a life that feels both meaningful and manageable.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing what truly matters and letting go of the rest.
It's about finding that sweet spot between effort and impact, between striving and allowing ourselves to simply be.
Beautifully said. And that sweet spot is going to look different for everyone. The 80-20 principle is a guide, not a rigid set of rules.
Right. It's about embracing a mindset of continuous exploration and refinement, figuring out what works best for us as individuals.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. What works today might not work tomorrow. The key is to be open to adapting and adjusting our approach as needed.
So it's about being flexible and responsive to the ever-changing landscape of our lives.
Precisely. The 80-20 principle isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a framework for thinking about our lives and our choices in a more intentional way.
It's about taking the time to understand ourselves, our strengths, our passions, our happiness islands, and then crafting a life that reflects those insights.
Beautifully put. It's about being the architects of our own lives, designing a life that feels authentic and fulfilling.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 80-20 principle, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
That's a good question. I think it's to embrace the 80-20 principle, not as a means to an end, but as a journey of self-discovery and a path to a more intentional life.
So it's not about achieving some specific outcome, but about the process of growth and self-awareness that comes from applying these principles.
Exactly. It's about being curious, experimenting, finding what works best for you. And remember, the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
Beautifully said. So, dear listener, we encourage you to embark on this journey of exploration. Discover your 20%, those key areas where focusing your time and energy can unlock your greatest potential for happiness, success, and a life that feels truly aligned with your values.
And don't forget, we're all in this together. Share your 80-20 discoveries, your insights, your challenges, your triumphs. Let's create a community of support as we navigate this path toward a more fulfilling and intentional way of living.
Until next time, happy diving. It really seems like this 80-20 principle, it's not just some productivity hack.
Yeah.
It's a whole different way of thinking about life.
I think you're right. It's about recognizing that we all have limited energy and attention.
Right. We can't do everything.
We can't be everything to everyone, so we have to make choices.
Yeah. And the 80-20 principle,
Hmm.
it kind of gives us a framework for making those choices more consciously.
Exactly. It's about being intentional with our time and energy and focusing on the things that truly matter to us.
Instead of just letting life happen to us.
Right. We're not just passive passengers. We're the drivers of our own lives.
We're in the driver's seat. That's a great analogy. I love that. But you know what I'm really struck by in all this is that sense of freedom that comes with the 80-20 principle. It's like you're saying, it's okay to let go of the need to do it all.
It really is. It's okay to say no to things that don't align with our values or our goals.
Yeah.
It's okay to prioritize our own well-being.
And I think that's so important, especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with messages about doing more, achieving more, being more. It's easy to get caught up in that hustle culture and feel like we're always falling short.
Absolutely. But the 80-20 principle reminds us that it's not about doing everything. It's about doing the right things, the things that bring us joy, the things that make a real difference. And sometimes that means saying no to the rest.
And that can be a really powerful act of self-care. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 80-20 principle, what's the one message you really want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Oh, that's a tough one. There are so many great takeaways. But I think the most important thing is to remember that the 80-20 principle is not a rigid set of rules. It's a guiding principle that can help you create a life that's both more productive and more fulfilling.
More productive, A&D, more fulfilling.
Yeah,
I love that. So it's not about sacrificing one for the other. It's about finding that sweet spot where both can thrive.
exactly. And that sweet spot is going to be different for everyone. The key is to experiment, to find what works best for you. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
So true. And it's a journey that we can all take together. So, dear listener, we encourage you to embrace the 80-20 principle and see where it leads you. Discover your 20%, those key areas where focusing your time and energy can unlock your greatest potential for happiness, success, and a life that feels truly aligned with your values. And don't forget to share your discoveries with us. We'd love to hear about your 80-20 journey. Until next time, happy diving.